Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I am Lieutenant Colonel Joe Robinson, Commanding Officer of the 4th Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, member of the Board of the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, and I will be your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon's event. I would like to welcome you to this official opening of the new galleries within the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum. At the start of the program, we will be welcoming 3 General Officers of the Royal Canadian Regiment and our Colonel of the Regiment, Colonel Joe Aitchison. As you are able, I would ask that you stand for the general and regimental salutes that will mark their arrival. Following the ceremony and ribbon cutting, VIPs and dignitaries will lead into the doors of the museum facing us, after which you are all invited to tour the museum. Since it may take a while to get everyone through the entrance, please feel free to speak to any of our participants today and visit the static displays. Behind us, you will find a weapons display provided by soldiers of the 4th Battalion, along with a sniper team from the 3rd Battalion stationed in Petawawa, who have brought some of their equipment down to show with us today. As part of Doors Open London, the RCRM Museum will remain open throughout our ceremony. We are also pleased to announce that as part of Doors Open London, we will also be able to see a display of the Secrets of Radar Museum, which is being placed in our special events gallery, which can be found by passing through the gift shop. Wolseley Barracks has been a garrison of the Royal Canadian Regiment since 1888, when D Company of the Infantry School Corps was established here in Wolseley Hall. Occupied over time by the 1st, 2nd, and now the 4th Battalions of the regiment, among other components of the regiment, it is the soldiers of the 4th Battalion who serve the regiment today in greeting our most distinguished guests. This quarter guard, formed by 4 RCRs, wearing the regiment's traditional full-dress scarlet uniform with the white Wolseley helmet. As this uniform continues to serve in the modern era as the regiment's ceremonial dress, the soldiers carry the current Canadian Forces rifle when on parade. Brigadier General Mike Jorgensen, Chief of Staff to the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff. Brigadier General Omer Lavoie, Commander, 4th Canadian Division. Brigadier General Jim Sims, Chairman of the Regimental Senate and Commander of the Canadian Forces Joint Operational Support Group. Colonel Joe Aitchison, Colonel of the Regiment, the Royal Canadian Regiment, accompanied by Colonel Bill Pettipaw, Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the 4th Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. We ask that you please remain standing for the playing of our national anthem. Ask you to remain standing for the Regimental Prayer. Today we honor the history of the Royal Canadian Regiment, a multifaceted tale that follows Canada's history through peace and war in Canada and abroad. In the memory of the many Canadians who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in service to our nation in each of the units we represent, I would like to ask the Chaplain of the 4th Battalion, Captain David Gallus, to offer the Regimental Prayer.
Almighty God, we humbly implore thy blessing on the Royal Canadian Regiment and all of us who serve therein. Help us to prove worthy to accept the high ideals and traditions of the past, to honor and revere the memory of those who have gone before us, to face our responsibilities in the future in both peace and war with courage, justice, love, honesty, and faithfulness. Remove all greed, hatred, selfishness, and envy from our thoughts, that we may render true service to the regiment, for thee, our God, for our fellow man, and for country. Amen.
Please be seated. Our regiment has marched through Northwest Canada, South Africa, and across the battlefields of Italy, Northwest Europe, and Korea. Most recently, our troops have fought in the Balkans and Afghanistan. While the tradition of sending bands with our soldiers to far-flung fields of battle are over, it is timely that we remember that music has long been an element of military service. The band of the Toronto Black Watch Association, providing music for us today, will now play our regimental march, St. Catharines, and the Maple Leaf Forever. I would like to introduce now the Chair of the Board of the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, Brigadier General Retired Gary O'Brien.
Right Honorable Ed Holder and Right Honorable Irene Matheson, Colonel of the Regiment, Colonel Joe, Generals, honored guests, members of the regiment, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Today, I am incredibly pleased to be here at this wonderful event to celebrate what has been a long and fruitful undertaking to finally open the newly renovated and expanded RCR Regimental Museum. My job today is to recognize the hundreds of people who have contributed both generous donations, hard work, and dedicated service to the museum. The museum today is a result of two combined fundraising activities which raised approximately $7 million, which covered renovation and expansion of the museum space, new exhibits, and updates to the operating systems we use to support the museum today. At this point, I'd like to point specifically to thank our donors for their generosity. Now, it would be impossible for me to thank every individual donor by name. Some are anonymous and need to be recognized, but I would just like to go through some of the more generous donors. A supporting patron of the regiment, I'd like to thank the CF Museums and Historical Collections Section 5 of the Directorate of History and Heritage of the Department of National Defence, the Infrastructure Stimulus Fund, Canada, Ontario, the Government of Canada. As a sustaining patron of the regiment, the Royal Canadian Regiment Trust. As a patron of the regiment, Margaret Migsy Lawson, the Lawson Foundation, Marcia Gould, the Charles H. Ivey Foundation, Anne Lowry, St. John Holdings Limited, the New Ontario Trillium Foundation, and David B. Weldon. For those members who contributed at the endowment and capital campaign members of the regiment, the Walter J. Blackburn Foundation, Chief Warrant Officer Robert W. Craig and Miss Daisy V. Craig, Lieutenant Colonel R.P.L.O. DeGobio, Colonel Richard Dillon, General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, Colonel Ian Halden, Brigadier General John C. Hayter and Fran Hayter, the Historica Foundation of Canada, Richard and Beryl Ivey Fund, Jessex Kutats, Knock Manufacturing, Lieutenant Colonel John Lawson and Ruth Lawson, Francis Learners, L.B. Barristers and Solicitors, the Corporation of the City of London, the T.R. Megan Foundation, Militex Coatings, the Molson Foundation, the Department of National Defence, Millennium Fund, the Province of Ontario, the RCR Association, the national level, Mr. and Mrs. W. Mowbray Sifton, Lieutenant General J.E. Vance, and the W. Garfield Western Foundation. I know that was a long list of recognizing, but we have so many generous people in our community who have generated huge contributions to our museum, and I'd like to thank all of those people who have participated in the in both of the fundraising events. Along with the key donors, there's a number of people that I would also like to thank who have made this journey possible. Some of them not with us today, but certainly need recognition of their contribution to the overall state the museum will find today. Mr. Gordon Pinsett, our Honorary Chair, Capital Campaign. Mr. Doug Weldon, the Chair of the Capital Campaign. Mr. John Lawson, the Chair for the Endowment Campaign. Dick Dillon, Founding Chair of the RCR Museum. Mr. Ed Quinn, former Chair of the Museum. Nancy Poole, Honorary Member of the Museum Board of Directors. Tom Burdett, and I believe his wife is here today. Bob Mahar Sr., who has left us. Barb Ivy as well. Mr. Klaus Breed, the former Director Curator of the Museum, and Mr. Greg Jeruba, former Regimental Fund Development Officer, who is involved in the campaign funds. Specifically, Brigadier General Phil Spencer, who led the museum board through these campaigns, and his hard work and dedication. Now that I've addressed the donors and thanked them very much for their kindness and their generosity, I think it's also important that we point out thanks to the number of volunteers that we have who have spent numerous hours both in helping create the museum space or as guides working in the kit shop. There are too many to be named here, but most certainly I want to put in heartfelt thanks to all of the volunteers who make the museum work today. The museum, of course, is a living entity, and the future holds many projects to continue and improve the accessibility to our collection. Some of our next projects will include the management of the collection space in our basement, new products to be offered to the public, including visitor service, education programs that are linked to the curriculum, and digitization of our exhibition for interpretation and, of course, bilingualism. Last on our target list is a more vibrant and robust website. I want to be short and make sure that I can get on to the rest of the day. This has been a huge accomplishment, led most recently by our curator, Georgiana Stansu, who requires a huge vote of thanks. So on behalf of all of us today, thank you very much.
Thank you, General O'Brien. I would like to introduce now the commander of 4th Canadian Division, Brigadier General Omer Lavoie. Brigadier General Lavoie commands the higher formation to which 4 RCR, 31 Canadian Brigade Group, and Wolseley Barracks belong.
Do a radio check here. This is working. Colonel of the Regiment, Colonel Aitchison, Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Pettipaw, my current serving RCR General, Brigadier General Sim, Brigadier General Jorgensen, recently retired General O'Brien, retired general officers, distinguished guests, certainly troops on parade, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start off, I guess, by saying, wow, I'll start off. I came here a few days ago thinking that I was going to be talking to a small group of folks in the museum itself. Being a general officer, I think I could cuff that without having any remarks written. So I'll couch my remarks here by saying I haven't written a speech because I didn't think I was giving one, and nor do I intend to. And that could be good or bad. The good news is I don't have a 20-page speech to read. The bad news is I could go off on a tangent talking about my favorite subject, which is soldiers and soldiers in operations. But I'm really here in the capacity, I'll say, represent the chain of command, and in one sense as a landlord for London. I'll keep my remarks, try to keep them targeted to those two subjects, chain of command, and as well talk a little bit about Afghanistan, where I have a bit of experience. So I'll talk about the Afghanistan piece first, because I think part and parcel of this museum opening here is the news piece of that, the exhibitions in there certainly has the RCR's contribution to the fight and the war in Afghanistan. And I'll say quite up front, for those folks who know me, who work with me, I'm not the most sensitive guy in the world, but I can tell you when I walked into that exhibit a few days ago, getting the sort of the recce, I guess, before I came here, and turn around that corner and seeing those task force placards, the battle camp signs, task force 306 and 207, and the other ones that followed on, I can tell you, it left me for a point there speechless and a bit emotional, and certainly brought me back to a time, 7 years ago to this day. In fact, we're still fighting in Medusa, and I'll mention 7 years ago tomorrow, we lost a member of the RCR, Private Kluki, on a combat patrol fighting at that time. So instantly brought back to those times, seeing those artifacts, still being able to see and feel the dust that characterized our time in Afghanistan. So that to me is just a tribute, pure and simple, to the quality of capturing that, which is what it's all about. And I'll tie that, I guess, to my current job and my experience as far as the chain of command goes, in terms of the fighting spirit of the RCR. And that's really what I think is captured in there. And if you look through it, to me it's about soldiers, it's about achievement, but it's also about sacrificing. And if you look through those exhibits, and anywhere we served, and especially on the expeditionary side, there's a common theme there. So whether it's at Paardeberg, any of the battles in World War I, Mons, Vimy, Passchendaele, you name it, Korea, Koan, Song, or Tona, and up to modern day Afghanistan, and you look at those exhibits, but if you look mostly at the soldiers, you see that common theme, that fighting spirit, which I can say as commander of 4th Canadian Division, having the privilege of commanding all 4 battalions right now, or having all 4 battalions of the regiment under command, I can tell you that spirit is still alive and well today, and I've experienced firsthand in combat. And what I see in all those exhibits, you look in those soldiers' eyes, and you see that dedication, that service to country, and most of all, proud Canadians and courage. And we experienced that up until the present day fight that we are in now. The other thing, though, we see is achievement and sacrifice. So all those battles that I've talked about, going back as far as you want, when the Royals have been put into the fight, they've achieved and taken the objectives that they were assigned to do. At the same time, though, it was done with a lot of sacrifice, as we all know, and as we've most recently experienced with the 28 RCR badge soldiers that we've lost in the fight in Afghanistan. So what I'd ask you today, when you go through that, is just to remember those themes and that timeless, I think that timeless piece of soldiers, achievement, and sacrifice. Thank you, and pro patria.
Thank you, General Boyd. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time I'd ask you to please welcome the Royal Scots. The Upper Thames Valley Military Reenactment Society portrays the 1st Regiment of Foot Royal Scots Light Company in the War of 1812. This regiment and company was based in the town of Delaware in March of 1814. They fought in the Battle of Longwoods just east of Wardsville on March 4th, 1814. They recreate the look and the drill of those men who fought in this regiment during the War of 1812. The main tactic used during the war by both British and U.S. forces was the mass volley, which they will demonstrate. Volley firing balanced the inherent inaccuracy of this smooth-bore weapon. Slow to fire, the 75 caliber Brown Bess musket took about 20 seconds to load. As a light company, these soldiers were also trained to fight spread out in front of the main battalion. As a final measure in attack or defense, the soldiers also carried the 17-inch triangular blade. While the official lineage of the Royal Canadian Regiment does not extend as far back as the War of 1812, a connection has recently been established. In 2012, the Canadian government decided to recognize the actions of units of that conflict. In doing so, the government decided to award battle honors and that these would be perpetuated by existing units of the Canadian Army based upon the concurrence of recruiting areas. Because the 4th Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment continues to recruit soldiers from Oxford and Middlesex counties, the RCR now perpetuates 3 units of that era and carries the battle honors Detroit, Niagara, and the Defence of Canada 1812-1815. Ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Scots, helping to keep history alive. Please feel free to speak to any members of the unit after the ceremony if you wish. Marking our ceremony today in the museum's role in preserving Canadian history, I would like to call our keynote speaker to the podium. Jonathan Vance is professor and J.B. Smallman Chair in the Department of History at Western University, where he teaches military history, Canadian history, and social memory. A native of Waterdown, Ontario, he holds degrees from McMaster University, Queen's University, and York University, and taught at a variety of institutions before coming to Western in 1997. Dr. Vance holds the Canada Research Chair in Conflict and Culture in the Department of History at Western University. We are also privileged to have Dr. Vance as a member of the board of the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum. Dr. Vance.
Thank you, Colonel Robinson. To members of the regimental family, friends of the regiment, welcome. Let me say at the outset that I am no relation to General Jonathan Vance of this regiment. Let me also assure you that I'm not here by accident. The organizers were not hoping to get General Vance and had to settle for Professor Vance instead. My connection to Canada's military is as one of its historians. And if you write about Canada's military history, you write about the Royal Canadian Regiment. In many ways, the regiment's story is Canada's story. The RCR story does not begin on 21st of December 1883, when the regiment was formally established from the Infantry School Corps. As Colonel Robinson said a few moments ago, the regiment's history goes back many decades before that, and indeed before Confederation, to the founding of the units that it perpetuates, beginning with the loyal London Volunteers, the Oxford and Middlesex militia regiments that fought in the War of 1812, through the local militia units, including the 7th Fusiliers of London, 22nd Regiment Oxford Rifles. So the RCR story is also London's story and this region's story. But I don't have the time to give you the history of the regiment, even in an abbreviated form. The published regimental history is a multi-volume set that can be supplemented by many volumes of memoirs. The newly renovated museum has over 8,000 square feet of display space to tell the story of the museum. I have just 7 minutes, or really 5 left, if you're counting. All I can do is give you some highlights. This day in regimental history, if you like, or rather this weekend, because it turns out that today's opening falls on an eventful weekend in the life of the RCR. So 113 years ago, on September the 30th, 1900, the last member of the Royal Canadian Regiment to die in the South African War, Private R.W. Le Couture, was killed in a railway accident on the way to Cape Town. He was the last of the 68 men of the RCR who lost their lives during that conflict. 95 years ago today, on the 20th of September 1918, the regiment was regrouping after action along the Conbury Road at Malkrang. This was in the middle of 4 days of fighting that would cost 89 dead and missing and 204 wounded. And it was on this day, 95 years ago, that Milton Gregg won the Victoria Cross. 80 years ago, in September 1933, the regiment observed its 50th anniversary. And on hand for the regimental dinner, right here in London, was Colonel Douglas Young, the only survivor of the original unit, the Infantry School Corps of 1883. 69 years ago, on the 20th of September 1944, the regiment was coming out of an attack on the Gothic line in Italy. The next day, it would be visited by the Minister of National Defense, J.L. Ralston. A year later, on the 29th of September 1945, a liner bearing the regiment brought it back to Halifax from the Second World War. The regiment itself reached London here at around 2 p.m. on the 1st of October. 61 years ago, on the 20th of September 1952, the 1st Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, was holding the Jamestown line in Korea. And E Company spent part of the day beating off an attack by an enemy patrol. 55 years ago, on the 25th of September 1968, the end of the Royal Canadian Regiment's parachute company came with the final jump over Camp Borden. All of these events, and many, many more, are part of regimental history and regimental lore. And indeed, when you look more deeply into the regiment's past, you find that in many ways, the Royal Canadian Regiment story is Canada's story. As its name suggests, the regiment is truly a national community. Private Le Couture, who died in 1900 in South Africa, was from Quebec. Milton Gregg was from New Brunswick. Strom Galloway, who became acting CO of the regiment after the Gothic Line action, was born in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, and first joined the militia in St. Thomas. So London is home of the regiment's museum, but the regimental family spans the country. And as you explore the regiment's history, you explore the nation's history. And you see that whenever Canada is called, the men and women of the Royal Canadian Regiment have responded, and responded in full order. So to conclude, I would like to congratulate our curator and her team for tireless work in bringing us to this reopening. And I invite you to explore the history of the regimental family in this fine museum later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vance. A few years ago, the Royal Canadian Regiment published in its annual journal the bugle calls of the three regiments that were amalgamated in the 1950s to form the regiment as it is known today. These are the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Oxford Rifles, the Canadian Fusiliers City of London Regiment Machine Gun, For much of its early history, the Royal Canadian Regiment occupied 4 company garrisons. During this era, the daily life of the barracks and basic communication, both in garrison and on the battlefield, were assisted by the use of bugle calls. Recently rediscovered in the museum's collection, in a package of information prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Harry T. Cock for the writing of the regimental history in 1936, are the scores for bugle calls of the regimental headquarters and the 4 companies. The regimental headquarters. A Company. B Company. C Company. And D Company. Today, the local Great War Reenactment Society keeps alive that memory of early military training in the service of hundreds of thousands of Canadians in France and Flanders. Wearing authentic reproductions of the clothing and equipment of the First World War soldier and carrying the same weapons and equipment, these practical historians are gaining an understanding of the Great War soldier's life and living conditions. Among the experiences they recreate and must learn to provide a realistic experience is the basic foot drill. Drill with arms. They would also spend many days learning to fire their personal weapons. In the early days of the Great War, the ill-fated Canadian-made Ross rifle, and in the late war, the Lee Enfield. Soldiers would be expected to fire at ranges to 500 meters over iron sights. That is, with no optical sight to assist in their aiming. And the pre-war standard for regular soldiers was up to 15 rounds per minute from these bolt-action rifles. In anticipation of facing the enemy at close quarters, throughout the war, soldiers were taught to fire with their rifles and bayonets. While the trench warfare of the Great War was a completely different environment than many who had trained here expected, at least until experienced soldiers started to return and update training, each soldier was prepared as best the system could provide. During the war, thousands of soldiers trained at Wolseley Barracks, and the area east of Wolseley Hall was an expanse of tidy rows of canvas bell tents for their quarters. Today, the Royal Canadian Regiment commemorates not only the actions of the RCR on the battlefields of France and Flanders, but also the heritage, honors, and achievements of 5 infantry battalions raised in the counties of Middlesex and Oxford, and 1 machine gun battalion formed overseas. Ladies and gentlemen, our Great War reenactors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the pipes and drums of the Toronto Black Watch Association. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I would now like to invite to the podium the Colonel of the Regiment, Colonel Joe Aitchison. Following his comments, Colonel Aitchison will cross the parade square and cut the ribbon, officially opening the new galleries of the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum to the public. Once the doors are open, you are all invited to tour the museum. Taking position during Colonel Aitchison's remarks, and with the flag party of the home station, London District Branch of the Royal Canadian Regiment Association, representing generations of veterans of the regiment. Also taking post along the museum wing of the Wolseley Hall will be serving soldiers of the 4th Battalion, representing all serving members of the battalion. Colonel Aitchison.
Thanks, Joe. If my memory was as good as Omar Lavoie's, I'd walk out in front and extrapolate or speak extemporaneously. I won't, but you'll be appreciative of the fact that I don't. It's such a great pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to have as many people out as are here to share this opportunity, this event with us. It's particularly a pleasure to welcome and to thank the reenactors, the band of the Black Watch Association, our bugler, and in particular the soldiers of the 4th Battalion who put on a tremendous show today and without whom this would have been a much less successful event. As has been noted, the regiment traces its formal history back about 130 years. In fact, it's 130 years in December of this year. But beyond that, it shares a further 71 years of history as the 4th Battalion, which is garrisoned here in London and in nearby Perth County, perpetuates the units that were raised in this part of the country during the War of 1812. So what we're talking about really is recognition of something over 200 years of this regiment's history, and a part of that is what the museum's all about. Now, I say a part of that because museums fulfill many roles. They're the guardians of the artifacts and treasures that an organization accumulates over its lifetime. They recognize personalities that were important to the organizations. They reflect traditions and values. They may present the public face of the organization, but above all, they assist in telling the story of the organizations that they represent. And it's this storytelling function that I believe is the museum's most important function. It's a fact that the storytelling function also depends very heavily on other factors. Among them, the amount and the quality of the space that's available to house the things and the media that illustrate the story, and among them, of course, the full and part-time staff, along with their expertise who actually deliver the message. Behind that, there's a legion of fundraisers and other enablers who provide the unseen support that makes a quality museum possible. Having seen it, or when you see it, I'm certain that you'll agree with me that we have all of those elements here, and we in fact do have a very high-quality museum. This building, which in itself is very historically important, this is the first purpose-built military building in the Commonwealth. The exhibits, the media, would not be possible without the long-time ongoing support of the Regimental Council of the RCR, and I'd like to publicly thank the Council through Brigadier General Jim Sims, the Chair of the Regimental Senate, who's with us today. Thank you, Jim, and thank you very much for the support from the Council. I also need to recognize Brigadier General Gary O'Brien, the Chair of the Museum Board of Directors, who, with his board and committees, provides the day-to-day guidance and support required to knit all this together. And I would be remiss were I not to thank Owen Lavoie as the representative of the chain of command, who have provided such tremendous support to the regiment over the years of development of this museum. Many of you here today are personal, corporate, institutional, or governmental supporters who have donated or generated the funds necessary to make the museum a reality. And it would not be possible without you, and I thank you very sincerely for all your efforts. Individually and collectively, your historic and ongoing support is vital to us. And in conjunction with this, my ADC will be passing the hat shortly. I ask you to be very generous. Finally, and by no means least, I want to thank Dr. Georgiana Stancio, our curator, and through her, the current and past staffs, who at the end of the day translate all of these ideas and concepts into the reality that you and the wider public see when they visit the museum. I would also observe that given the long history of the regiment, the long connection of the regiment to London, Ontario, it's particularly significant and particularly appropriate that this reopening should be taking place when London's doors are open. To all of you, once again, thank you for being here today, for your past and future support to our regiment's efforts to tell our story. Pro Patria.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the formal portion of our opening ceremony. As we will all not be able to enter the museum at once, I invite you to view the static displays and to visit any of our participants while you wait an opportunity to join the line into the museum. The Royal Canadian Regiment, the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, thanks you for your attendance. Pro Patria.